Caroline Harris.
Thank you, Chair. Mark, if we can turn to something different, which, depending which side of the argument on, either extremely inspiring or extremely irritating. I suspect for you it's the latter. And that's
Okay.
Protest policing.
Yes.
What more do you need to be able to deal effectively with the more sophisticated style of protest policing in London at the moment?
So there's an act which has come in recently, and there's a bill going through at the moment which cover a lot of these issues. There are particular powers around, for example, people taking devices to lock on with them, so some of the more complex situations that have been created to give us more powers of stop and search and prevention on those. So those are being dealt with. My biggest concern, if I can push back here, is that I think Parliament has created a problem for policing in terms of the rule set for protest. The first point of law is that law should be clear, and actually the balance between what is lawful and reasonable and what is not is very, very unclear. And the reason is, so the 1986 Public Order Act creates some thresholds for police intervention around the phrase serious disruption to the life of the community. That has never ever been defined. That's quite a broad phrase that people interpret differently. That is then further complicated by the Human Rights Act, which creates principles about freedom of speech, etc. And so every time the police intervene, they have to work out serious disruption of the life of the community, is this proportionate, is this necessary, how does this fit with freedom of speech? And so basically Parliament has left a very grey space about what is lawful and what is unreasonable disruption, and are expecting police to work out a line through the middle of it. And the only way that line then gets tested is through the courts, and sometimes through criminal trials, sometimes through we get judicially reviewed or sued, and we win some of those and we lose some of those. And that grey space has been defined through that very painful police decision making and litigation process. So I think that Parliament should create provisions to enable clarity on that point, whether that's through primary legislation or creating provision for a code of practice to define that. I'll leave that to lawyers, but I think it's your job to say where the legal balance is, not to pass it to me to try and work through the fog, which is what happens. And that's why you get, and I've seen examples previously when I was in the Met, but I've seen it in the last 3 months where things get blown around politically depending on who's protesting, and what the issue is depends on who's saying the police were too soft and who's saying the police were too hard on the same incident. And that's the difficult context we're working in. So I think the most helpful thing would be if you collectively were to draw a clearer line.
Effectively, we've created an environment where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So looking at October and November this year, there were 755 arrests.
Yep.
There were 182 charges brought, but there were nearly 12,000 police officers deployed in that. That's extremely disproportionate to the success rate in prosecutions. Are your officers having the training to be able to enforce the legalities, which obviously the protesters are able to... The sophistication of their operation is I would say, it's outstripping your ability to enforce.
They're very well trained. If this committee wanted a sort of private session with some of our public order commanders to go through their considerations and how they try and steer through this, I'd be very, very happy to set that up. So they're very expert. They've got sort of immense legal knowledge because they're trying to understand all of this case law and trying to work out where they draw the line. The public orders of policing is resource intensive, and it's deeply concerning to me that that's 12,000 officer shifts that weren't policing London's communities because they were dealing with protesters in the centre of London or on the M25 or wherever. And that's not taking account of some of the follow-up investigative work, which will add thousands more shifts into this as well. But public order policing is resource intensive because it's about dealing with crowds of people, and some of it is about moving people and it's about a gentle use of physical force. It's not all about criminal justice. So I wouldn't expect more than that. I mean, some of the recent legal changes that have been made have been helpful. So putting public nuisance on the statute book was helpful because it used to be a common law offence. It's now a statutory offence, and the more serious offenders, CPS have thought appropriate to charge with that more serious offence rather than obstruction of the highway. And so 26 of those have been remanded in custody, which I think has dampened the ardour of some of the protesters, which has been helpful. So those blocking the major routes, that's been useful. But there's also some real practical, one of the reasons it would be helpful if you wanted an operational briefing, the practical operational difficulties when someone uses a bicycle D-lock, if I say a D-lock, what I mean? Yeah. If someone D-locks themselves by their neck to the top of a gantry above a motorway, then that's not a 5-minute job to remove them without decapitation, which is clearly beyond proportionate. So actually, if you've got to angle grind a D-lock off somebody's head safely whilst working at height, that is a very complicated thing to do. And so even though in most of these cases the police are there in a few minutes, some of them take some time to clear. And that's been a real challenge for us. And because of the significance of the motorway network, that's why some of these offenders have been charged with public nuisance rather than merely highway obstruction, and it's been treated more seriously because of the obvious. I mean, these cases are very obviously serious disruption. I'm not pretending there's not clarity there.
Why do you have to remove them? Why can't you just leave them there and let the traffic continue? I'm completely up for that.
The Highways Agency feel there is a safety risk, and that's their call. And I'm not criticising. I can understand their call because they're concerned, I think, probably more about drivers being distracted than they are about the individuals. And they have all the expertise on driver distraction on motorways, and if that's their call that it's dangerous, then so be it. I mean, I would love to ignore all these characters, but it's not always possible.
Well, that's very interesting. So far you've blamed Parliament and the Highways Agency.
No. I didn't blame them. I said that's their decision. It wasn't my decision, but I also said I'm not criticising them for it because I can understand the distraction factor. That's a big concern for them.
I think to follow up on the protesters, which has obviously been a very topical issue and has certainly filled mailboxes of MPs with the public rightfully outraged, many of whom have said, well, if they've de-locked themselves to a gantry, then they're quite safe. Why do we have to stop all the traffic for however many hours it takes then to bring them down? You've said you'll be up for just leaving them there. The National Highways have all sorts of warning signs when there are other potentially distracting hazards on the motorway. They can get everybody to slow down or whatever without having to stop the motorway. So aren't we actually just pandering to them by giving them the attention? And they're having a causal effect, which is to cause major disruption on major roads to thousands of cars with people trying to go about their daily business.
I'm not going to criticise another agency's decision. I'm just explaining the decision-making process. But I understand that point of view.
Okay. So in terms of why it's all Parliament's fault and the greyness of the law, as you put it. So Section 137 of the Highways Act 1980 says it is an offence if a person without lawful authority or excuse in any way willfully obstructs the free passage along a highway. What's grey about that?
What's grey about that is the Human Rights Act means that you can't always apply it because there is case law which says more than minor disruption to the roads may still be lawful protest. So this is why I say Parliament has created a confusing space, because we're not legally, we can't interpret that highways obstruction offence on its own. We have to balance it against the will of Parliament in that legislation against the will of Parliament from the legislation, the Human Rights Act. And the case law says some highways obstruction is perfectly reasonable in the context of protest being that lawful excuse. So it's another example of the grey area.
Okay, it doesn't mean that they have to carry out that protest on the road blocking the traffic. They could be instantly removed to the embankment or pavement adjoining the road to carry on their right to protest. Would you not interpret it like that? Why do they have to protest by causing maximum disruption across a highway?
Because I don't have to interpret that. That's the way the courts have created sort of binding precedent that it must be interpreted. There's a case called Ziegler, which is on this point. And I agree with the principle of what you're saying, but of course, once we start to use force to push people from the road to the pavement, they may resist. You end up in an arrest situation. Is that lawful? And if the courts are saying, actually, it is lawful and reasonable in some circumstances to do a protest that creates disruption on the roads, which the courts have said that, then us intervening is illegal. That's part of that greyness that Parliament has created.
So, do you look on enviously at your equivalent in the Paris police force, where equivalent Just Stop Oil, or whatever that is in French, protesters block a road in Paris, and the minute the police or gendarmerie arrive, they are removed, whether they're glued to the pavement or not. France is subject to very similar human rights legislation to us. So why can they do it but we can't?
You need an expert in international jurisprudence to cover that point. You will see examples of us moving that quickly when people have glued themselves to roads. We move very, very quickly to remove them because that goes beyond reasonable. But there are other situations where people have been walking down roads and they're minor roads where we haven't felt it appropriate to intervene because the law wouldn't support us. So that's the balance point.
That's not the impression that's been given to the public, is it, about a rapid response to this? Because certainly, although they appear to have suspended their activities at the moment, presumably because it's too cold and they want to be in their nice warm fossil-fuelled homes, but the College of Policing has this 5-step appeal model, so that police officers are required to follow each of these 5 steps before taking action, which starts with a simple appeal, ask the person to comply, then goes on to a reasoned appeal, then apparently goes on to a personal appeal, then presumably goes on to offering them water and asking them if they're going anywhere nice for their holidays, before eventually...
That's glib and not accurate.
Well, you know, we've certainly seen them giving out water and officers saying, are you all right? Well, they'll be much safer if they weren't sitting in the road with lots of angry commuters trying to get to their jobs. That's such a long, drawn-out process that the College of Policing has come up with. Do you think that's appropriate still?
So we get through that process in a couple of minutes in cases where it requires it. So whether that process takes half an hour or sort of seconds or minutes depends on the situation. But if someone is blocking a major road, which is clearly causing massively excessive disruption, then that process won't hold us up. The only thing that might hold us up, is the physicality of it. If someone is literally not removable because they're glued or locked to something, then that takes time. But that process won't hold us up if there is an urgent need to remove them.
So, if a number of them have been prosecuted,
yeah,
some of us would say perhaps that should be more, and perhaps the penalties should be more severe. That's a matter for the courts. So the courts have set the precedent that by causing obstruction or on whatever basis they're being prosecuted, they are prosecutable. So it's not as though they are coming up with completely different forms of gluing themselves to the road or locking arms across the road. It's now fairly easy for the police to recognise that an offence has been committed and it is highly likely to be upheld in the courts based on the however many 186 have been prosecuted, notwithstanding human rights protest considerations. So are you getting much, much quicker at removing them now than you were when they first started on the basis of that, or not? Because it doesn't look like it.
So we are much quicker, and in the first week or so, there were a few occasions where I think we weren't as quick as we should have been, and I've said that publicly and I'll say it again. But in the majority of this, we've been as rapid as we've been able to be. The only two things that have stopped us removing people rapidly have been the physicality of the situation, like glues and locks and things sometimes slows you down. in some circumstances. And the second thing that's meant that we haven't removed people immediately at a few occasions has been when the disruption hasn't been that serious, it's been on minor roads, and our judgment is the current legal framework doesn't empower us to do so. So, except where it's been physically or legally impossible, we've been very speedy for the vast majority of these occasions and very successful.
Do you feel restrained in picking somebody up who has glued his or her hands to the tarmac, whereas in France they just seem to pick them up, and whether the tarmac is still attached to their hand or not is the lookout of the protester rather than of the police officer?
So, our advice is that we need to use sort of solvent removers for the glue rather than on the basis that reduces the harm done to them. I understand.
Whose advice is that?
Just legally, in terms of what's reasonable force and what we're allowed to do. That's our advice. But I'll always go and reflect on it. But the law is about using minimal force, and if there is a way within a few minutes to remove somebody without causing significant harm to their hands, then we're expected to do that. And I understand. I mean, you're obviously massively frustrated by it. I'm not advocating this as a sort of perfect solution. I'm just advocating the legal and practical context we work in.
Well, I, as many MPs, have been massively frustrated because it takes up a lot of our email boxes and we get a lot of flack for it. You're massively frustrated because it's diverting a lot of your officers from catching criminals and keeping the public safe. They appear not to have a similar problem in other European countries subject to the same human rights laws. They're rather more proactive in saying, right, we're not having that. And you said there's greyness in the law. There's policy from national highways or whatever. It seems that we're just going around in circles on this. We're all frustrated. Everyone's losing out, trying to get on with their lives. It's costing you a lot of money and diverted police officers, and yet still we've got this problem, or we will have when the cold snap ends, presumably.
So, a part of the solution. So there's always sharper ways to police, and we'll constantly look at ways of doing that. I say the first week or so we could have been quicker. There's also clarity in legislation, and I know from the conversations we've had with the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister that they're keen to look at whether there's sharper distinctions in terms of what's legal and what's not legal. My point about serious disruption that would help us. I know that they are working on that at the moment, see if they can make some progress on it for us.